and welcome to the Fall in Love with Teams webinar series. Today's episode is how to smoothly switch from Skype to Teams. Justin Preston from the Microsoft Global Customer Success team is joining us today. Thanks for being here, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Today we'll be covering best practices, strategy, and tactics you can use to make the transition to Teams at your organization. Now, a lot of the best practices we're going through don't just apply to Skype, but they also apply to other technologies as well that you might be making the switch from, whether it's BlueJeans or WebEx or Zoom, etc. So we're noticing some teamwork trends in the global workplace environment today. We're seeing a lot of diversity. So for the first time ever, we have 4 generations of individuals working together. And of course, all of these generations have different communication styles and different communications preferences and different tools that they like to use. Another trend we're seeing is that in today's workplace, a lot of the work being done is more team-based and collaborative. So about 80% of employee time is really spent collaborating. We're also, of course, noticing that team working trends are becoming more global and more remote. How is Microsoft 365 and Teams really filling the needs with so many different teamwork trends today?
Thanks again for having me, Jesse. When it comes to Microsoft Teams, you can think of the application or the service as really addressing these components in a couple of different ways. So the first is when we look at Teams as a style or a way of communicating, it really lends itself primarily to the latter generations who have grown up with the internet, asynchronous messaging in the case of email, and now real-time messaging with things like Skype for Business, Teams, and other platforms that are in the marketplace. So first way I'd address the question is we're really trying to meet customers where they are and present them with a new style for collaborating that spans across these different generations. From a collaboration perspective, Teams is really aptly suited at helping customers drive collaboration inside of their environment.
So it's not just Skype for Business, but also, other applications as well, where, Skype for Business was great. It was a really robust communications platform, but really Teams is coming together and, like you said, really integrating the other features and capabilities of Office 365 and bringing those to the forefront in a way that a lot of individuals may not have even realized the capabilities of that. So it's really Teams is creating this focal point and this very much a hub where you can access all of the great capabilities, both that come within Teams, but also within Microsoft 365. Can you tell us about some of the advanced features and benefits of Teams today?
We really wanted to think about how do we take advantage of Office 365, of which Teams is a component. Secondarily, what types of things are customers looking to do today in order to either integrate existing applications or start to build applications, new experiences, and present those to their users? When folks are collaborating on content, where does that content live? How easy is it for them to find that content, to share that content, to round trip it, and even to share it with folks that are external to the environment? Another kind of key problem that we built Teams around is being able to have visibility into what's happening inside of an organization or team. So on my particular team at Microsoft, we have a mantra that's called working out loud. And the idea there is that there's nothing that I, as an individual person on the team, should feel subconscious or self-conscious around sharing with my peers. So in that case, we typically try to be default open and post all of the things that we're working on to the requisite Teams channels or Teams chats, such that we can both let people know what we're doing and then also to solicit feedback and help when necessary. So I think those pieces are really unique to Teams, of being able to broadly disseminate information, leverage a group of folks in a very quick feedback loop so that you can move projects and content forward, and then presenting all of the different application services and content in one interface for users to be able to take advantage of.
You can actually now integrate Yammer communities right into the left-hand menu bar in Teams, which is so wonderful. You don't even have to go to your browser to access Yammer now. So we're going to discuss just some best practices and tactics that you at your organization you can use to make the switch to Teams. So these are best practices, not just for Skype, but for any technology that you're going to switch over to Teams from. So one of the first things that you want to take a look at and ensure that you put together a strong project team. But your project team you should really try to include not just individuals in IT, but also some key stakeholders from the business or work stream. I know, Justin, that Microsoft leverages ProSci, which is a global change management methodology. And one of the top things that they advocate for is having clear and active sponsorship and leadership throughout the project to ensure its success. Could you tell us a little bit about how you encourage organizations to leverage sponsors, leverage champions when they're rolling out teams?
A key part of building intent for any project or buy-in, if you want to think of it that way, is to engage the right folks from a sponsorship perspective. Where we see the most challenges in organizations for deploying any technology, but particularly something like Microsoft Teams, is lack of sponsorship. And that really comes across in that there's an IT component to this deployment, right? Enabling users, enabling licenses, making sure that your network is appropriately set up, making sure that your identities are appropriately set up, etc. But there's also a really key component of this deployment that's around business transformation and engaging BDMs and understanding how is their world going to be different potentially or affirmatively after they roll out Microsoft Teams, and being able to have someone at a sponsorship level who's responsive to those that feedback that you're getting from BDMs and who can give some reassurance and or who's taking that into account as they're driving the project forward is really, really key. We've called that kind of two levels of sponsorship here. So typically when we think about sponsors, we're typically talking about executive sponsorship or someone higher in the organization. But then we also have this other concept of sponsorship that we refer to as champions. And champions on some level may be even more important than at executive sponsorship, because these are the folks that are going to be at the grassroots level. They're the folks that are your most enthusiastic around the change that's happening or the technology that you're putting in. They're the folks that are going to be responsible for training and working with people that are actively managing, moving parts of their business from the old tool over to the new tool, for example. And it may in some cases be your first level of support as folks run into different issues as they're making that transition. So having a really strong champions network and engaging both those sponsors and champions in a consistent manner, keeping them abreast of what's going on, how the project's doing, the feedback that you're getting from your constituencies will help you to make this a really successful project.
And you had mentioned how this is not just an IT level change, it's really an enterprise organizational change. And as we're starting to find out, a lot of organizations are starting to find out, is that it really comes down to, digital transformation is human transformation, it's people transformation. There's some really great planning best practices that we have. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about best practices for scope and governance?
There's different ways that you can interoperate with the Teams platform. Particularly if you're coming from the Skype platform, you can run Teams in a side-by-side mode that we call islands, or you could run it in a more cooperative mode where you're leveraging Skype for some capabilities and you're leveraging Teams for other capabilities, but they essentially go together. Typically, scoping is done prior to the project, right? And governance is something that we would take into account. What's also been very interesting in the current time due to COVID-19 is that we're seeing a lot of folks that are rapidly moving to Teams, and then they're needing to come back and start to think about governance after the fact. So in that vein, I do want to point out that this is something that you can do beforehand, you can do it in parallel, or you can do it after the fact. Typically, in a more traditional deployment, you would do it beforehand or in parallel with your deployment. But there's always going to be some care and feeding to the environment that's going to happen after you turn up on Microsoft Teams. So in this case, a couple things to note. There's different policies that you can configure over how long are messages retained in Microsoft Teams, how long is content retained. And those are actually two different sets of policies that you can control for folks that are transacting on Teams information. What are the rights of users in the environment? So by default, everybody has the ability to create teams. You may be in an organization where you want to have some constraints on that or a managed process to go through users creating teams. Maybe you have some defined naming conventions or other attributes that you want to capture around those teams. Do you allow for external parties to be part of teams? Right. Teams similar to Skype for Business supports federation, where I can have external parties that are part of chats. I can have external parties that are part of teams. By default, the way that Teams works is if I add an external user, let's say Jessie in this case, to a team at Microsoft, by default, she will have access to all of the content in that team. So all channels, all artifacts, i.e. documents, all messages, etc. There's a mechanism in Teams today, for example, private channels, where you could actually segment those users or segment some of those conversations. So these are the kind of things you'll want to take into account as you're starting to think about your Teams environment. What is it that you want that end user experience to ultimately be? Where are the challenges today with respect to your current environment? And or what are the pain points or the risk factors that keep you up at night that you really want to start addressing from a governance strategy perspective?
Yeah. And really the point you made about, organizations, they may start to launch and then they may have to circle back to governance. And I think, honestly, that also applies to scope, vision, and success metrics, because we will see, a lot of organizations, they do kind of, they may have a period where they struggled, or let's say that they tried to roll out Teams, but for whatever reason, perhaps the communication, the champions networks just weren't there to prop up the project, so it might have stalled out. But it is never too late, no matter where you are in your Teams adoption, to circle back to some of these questions and start again, really just defining what's the governance, what's the scope. You can leverage all of the best practices that we're laying out in this webinar to really help you start fresh and start on that second phase of Teams, because as Justin said, Skype for Business is going to be decommissioned. So you just want to start preparing your organization for that change and make sure it's not a rushed thing that's going to happen right before decommission happens. Really creating within your vision, not just, what's the value of rolling out or deploying Office 365 or Microsoft 365 in Teams, because it has benefits for IT, but it's really helping to connect the dots for business users at every level and every different work stream across the organization, and really helping them understand what's in it for me. Why should I start using Teams? What are the benefits and the capabilities that are really going to help me out in my day-to-day, whether that's collaborating in one place, having all of my conversation and chat history saved, being able to co-author documents in a way that you weren't able to on Skype or another technology that you've been using. So just really taking that time to think about a vision statement that encompasses every level of your organization and really makes it clear what's in it for me as the user. So it's so important not only to focus on the people side, but also to make sure, that you are accounting for some of those questions that, Justin and I talked about when it comes to governance, when it comes to scope. So really understanding, things like your licenses, how many pilots are you going to run, your policies, your governance are really important to kind of take a look through those topics when you're really preparing your technical readiness plan. Justin, what are some best practices or some questions organizations need to be asking themselves when it comes to getting their technical readiness checklist accounted for?
Great. So first question, or first item I would call out would be really understanding what skills you have available to you inside of your organization. So Teams spans a number of different sort of technical domains. So there's networking, right? So do you have a good team in place who understands how the network is deployed today, what the limitations are, how traffic is routed today, and are they empowered to be able to make changes as necessary as you're rolling out Teams? Because Teams, for example, essentially wants to have a direct internet connection, and we'll go ahead and take care of all the routing and getting you to the closest point of presence. So networking is really, really key. Another really key kind of core service that you'll want to have folks turned up on is identity. Teams is going to leverage the underlying Azure Active Directory identity that we use for all Office 365 services. But depending on where you're coming from, let's say you're on Skype for Business on premises today, you may not have gone through the prerequisites of synchronizing your existing on-prem Active Directory into Office 365, which you do to essentially move all of your accounts, or at least create all of your accounts in the service. Once you have those accounts created, then there's some work that needs to be done to start leveraging Office 365 as your authentication method, or there's still some opportunity to leverage your on-premises Azure Active Directory. But those kinds of considerations you'll also need to work through more from a technical perspective. We touched a little bit of this on the governance side, but there's a whole set of policies that you can put into place with respect to teams, and these policies are cross workload in some cases. So you'll have, or they're specific to a workload. So they're specific, for example, meeting policies, live meeting policies, etc. And then there are like very horizontal user policies that you'll configure. Can users, record meetings? Can they invite external users to meetings, etc.
In a lot of organizations, what we see time and time again is that a lot of effort and energy and investment is put into the technology, but less so of an investment on the people side. So one of our, one of the essential things that we work with organizations to do is really understand, okay, well, now that the technical is accounted for, how do we get people to adopt to teams? How do we get them to understand the capabilities, to understand what's in it for me as the end user? One thing to note when it comes to adoption is creating that user journey from the current state. That's what tools and capabilities do I use today? What do I need to do in a transition state, whether you're in a hybrid mode, and then how is that going to change in the future? And so a lot of organizations sometimes they miss the keys, the larger picture, which is that they'll roll out just a couple of communications. Here's, Teams is here now, here, go into this learning platform. But really what you want to do as a best practice is create that user journey. So I think of it in terms of pre-launch, so we're announcing what's coming, and then we have training. We train our champions, we train our sponsors, we train their admins, we train key stakeholder groups so that everyone is ready when we get to actual launch. And then of course launch, really having some webinars available or your training plan in place, your communications plan going out, but then also post-launch. So now that I know what this, new technology is, and if I'm in an island mode where it's not going to, my Skype or another system is not going to be turned off or decommissioned for a couple of months, where do I go to learn more about how to use Teams and how to leverage it for me? So really creating a full user journey right from start to finish that doesn't just end the second it's launched. So Justin, what do you feel is the importance of the pilots in a successful team launch?
So as you think about these pilots, think about them both in the context of I have a specific technology or specific project that I'm rolling out, and I want to do some of that validation beforehand and slowly start to expand those rings to bring in business users or a more diverse set of users across the organization. But also think about it in the terms of the life cycle of a technology inside of your environment.
Let's talk about, wrap it back around to success metrics again. Of course, we have, as a project team, you can explore things like your admin metrics, but I would really encourage all of those organizations out there, if you're rolling out something as unique and cool as Teams, with all of the capabilities, both the collaborative, the co-authoring features, but also those larger integrations when it comes to other Microsoft 365, whether it's modern SharePoint or Yammer or OneDrive, or the other applications, really, take a moment when you're putting your plan together and say, okay, well, since we're launching this new way of working, let's also take a look at some of the behavioral changes we can take the opportunity to make, such as, let's say you're an email-heavy organization and you want to move away from that. So really take a look at those behavioral changes and set your project up in such a way that you can measure those, not only, when you launch, but start early and define what your baseline is, and then take measurements at key intervals all the way through the project. Justin, do you notice that as well when you're setting up success metrics through a project, that it's good to look at a couple of different behavioral changes or the voice of the user in addition to those Office 365 metrics?
Definitely. It's interesting that when we talk about, in this case, key behavioral changes, really what we're talking about is we're talking about culture. Right? We're talking about culture inside of organizations. And I mentioned earlier, that my team has this whole mantra about working out loud, but my team is part of a larger team at Microsoft. And we were meeting with the leader of the larger team, who's an executive at the company, and sort of talking through this whole idea about working out loud and sort of starting in Teams as the place to start work, etc. And, he was still in this mode of, I need to collaborate on a document. I'm going to, do it in email, and I'm going to send everybody the link. And yeah, we'll do co-authoring, and we'll leverage some of these capabilities. But he still really hadn't sort of made the shift into like being in this more open space where everybody has access and visibility into what's going on. And we got him to start posting just some, really straightforward content. This is my business review. Post that into Teams. Hey, I'm going into the next business review. I need some input into this content, and having folks, starting to feel comfortable doing that both out loud, in this case, quote unquote, or in public, but also just in a mechanism and in a form that's just different from how they're normally used to working. So when we talk about this behavior, recognize that it's really culture, right? Like Microsoft, when I joined, was an email-centric culture. Millions and millions and millions of email messages today. A day. We still send a lot of email, don't get me wrong, but the culture has really changed to be a much more real-time collaborative environment for a certain segment of folks at the company, right? We do have multiple generations that are working at Microsoft as well, and so there will be some folks that are just more comfortable with email, or that's where they want to live. And as we build these tools out, it's also important to make sure that we're pulling those folks in and meeting them where they live. So even in the case of something like Teams, if you send me a Teams message and I don't receive it, I will get an email saying that somebody's trying to reach you in Teams. If Jesse calls me and I miss the call, I will get an email saying somebody tried to call you in Teams, and here's that person, and here's how you can call them back. So when we think about this culture shift, recognize that it's not going to be 100%, and we just know that's the case, right? Not everybody's going to glom into this new paradigm. But even if they're still leveraging some of the additional paradigms that Microsoft provides, we want to connect them all together such that everybody can take advantage and collaborate together, leveraging the tools or the platforms that they feel most comfortable in, with some measure of shared buy-in, right? We're all in Office 365, or we've all, decided to leverage Office documents as the artifact, the place for us to build and manage artifacts in our environment.
I love this point you're making about, behavioral change really being cultural change. And one thing we've seen time and again with organizations we've worked with is that if you set up a good technical and people-focused plan and you see it through, you also at the same time are creating a more change agile. So if you really, take the time to really help people understand what's in it for me, you're actually creating a culture that is more, has a better ability to make those changes, but also feels more positively towards those changes. And even if you set up a great champions network to roll out Teams, let's say another change is coming along in your organization, you've already got that network set up. Why not leverage it again for the next change that's coming out and keep up that positive momentum? And we really do encourage organizations to look beyond just Teams and think about Microsoft 365 in a holistic long-term approach, because as Justin mentioned, there's so many additional capabilities that businesses are only just scratching the surface of today. So Justin, what do you feel like the place for celebrating successes is?
I think you're spot on, right? In the sense of there's both the folks that are making the change happen, there's folks that are living the change, consuming the change, et cetera. And all areas of the organization, we want to make sure that we're really celebrating the folks that are helping keep the lights on, helping the organization continue to move forward, helping the organization to move into modernity and beyond, right? Because we have lots of customers who still are leveraging older systems or haven't digitized their processes, et cetera. And so on one level, when we're talking about Teams, we're already talking about organizations that in a lot of measures are starting to be more forward thinking. But as your folks come along, it's important to recognize that they've made this journey with you, that they've really been able to consume these changes and or enhance them based on the feedback that they've given, and that's contributed to the overall success of the project.
Absolutely. So now we're going to hear from an organization who has just recently made a global switch from Skype to Teams, and then Justin will be back with us for the Q&A. Joining us is Jay Sambasivam from British American Tobacco. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Jay.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm glad to be with you guys and for you guys to give me an opportunity to share our story with you.
So I know that British American Tobacco just finished the launch of Teams to more than 60,000 individuals globally, which is a really amazing feat. And I know that you switched from Skype to Teams, and you've recently launched Teams to your first line workers. And I was just wondering, what advice do you have for other organizations who are making that switch from Skype to Teams?
Yes, so I know most program and project managers have heard this and know this, Jesse, but I would say the most important thing to consider before embarking on a similar journey for any organization would be to understand your organization's change adoption style. Then design a good change management plan that fits your organization and execute it. In our organization, we were using Skype, as you said, pretty extensively prior to the Teams migration. So the challenge that most people had in our organization was really to understand the additional features that Teams had to offer and start using them. But we did spend a fair amount of time identifying key stakeholders, getting executive sponsorship, and also crafting a crisp and focused communication for the migration. This helped our organization ready for adopting the tool, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of the right communication. This is key for any change management plan to work effectively.
Absolutely, Jay. You can't underestimate the power and the effectiveness of a great adoption change management plan and reaching the right stakeholders at the right time with the right message to ensure that you have positive perception from beginning to end. So, when you're launching a program where you're switching from Skype to Teams, and Skype has been heavily utilized, I'm sure that you faced challenges. So maybe what's a challenge that you had to overcome during your Teams launch?
Yes, that's a good question, Jesse. So we did have a couple of challenges. Talk about the first one here. Rolling it out to a massive organization like ourselves in different geographies was somewhat of a challenge, where we couldn't really use a classic big bang migration approach, but rather had to stagger the rollout and go live assistance. The other challenge, which in spite of all the business continuity exercises that organizations conduct all the time, could have never predicted the COVID-19 situation that the whole world is facing right now. So we had to adjust how we were going to go and support users after the migration, and had to make changes at the last minute on the fly from a physical command center to a virtual command center, which I might add, we pulled off very nicely with WM Reply's help.
Yes, thank you so much, Jay. And we were absolutely happy to step in and provide that hypercare support in definitely a time of urgency where we didn't want to delay the launch. We really wanted individuals out there in the field to have the Teams experience and the additional capabilities. So overall, what kind of value do you feel like Teams has added to BAT since it was launched?
So I think the organization as a whole is more productive and efficient with Teams in the mix for collaboration, co-authoring, and really generally keeping folks connected all the time. Teams is being effectively used where folks would have otherwise scheduled physical meetings or used traditional methods such as SharePoint or emails and wait for responses before they could proceed. And we're also implementing new features all the time and getting additional value from O365 tools such as Stream and Yammer, which has a greater outreach due to the access of Teams on mobile devices. I think we're just scratching the surface of the value that can be gotten from Teams, which will only increase over time.
Absolutely, Jay. I think you're right. I think there is so much more that Office 365 or Microsoft 365 is bringing to not only the Teams. Teams is really a central hub, but again, things like Stream, Yammer. Even right now, we're producing this webinar on Teams Live Event, which really would help with town halls, great customer meetings. So Teams is really a great central hub to keep organizations connected. You mentioned the mobile devices. So really, what trends in the workplace we're seeing is that a lot of people on the go, they need to be able to access their mobile devices and work really from anywhere, any time zone, any device as business becomes increasingly global. So Teams really is that central hub integrated with the entire Microsoft 365 platform, including SharePoint sites on modern SharePoint, et cetera. So great point with that. I'm just curious, what I know you've had a really great success launching Teams. I'm just wondering, what adoption rates are you seeing in Teams so far?
Yeah, that's another good question, Jesse. So our organization has been on a digital transformation journey for some time now. And our CIO, when she came into the organization, rebadged herself as CIDO to emphasize the digital aspect of IT. And the IT organization was also renamed as IDT, which stands for Information and Digital Technology. So we also don't see this digital transformation as an IT-centric transformation, but really an enterprise transformation for digital technology to be used as an enabler in how we fundamentally conduct our business in all functions. So we're roughly about 60,000 strong worldwide, and the US region is roughly about 10% of that, right? So the adoption rate was pretty high to begin with, but certainly now that we're all working from home, not only has the usage of basic Teams functionality has increased, but the usage of somewhat advanced features that Teams offers has also increased. So we're seeing success all around with the adoption on this, even more so than we would have otherwise seen.
Yeah, that's great to hear, Jay. And I think a lot of organizations out there, when they do put a proper adoption change management plan into place, they're really being able to recognize the return on investment there. Because as you made such a great point saying, it's not just, the change is not just an IT-centric change, it's an enterprise change, which is really digital transformation, comes back to people transformation, human transformation, and enabling people to understand the capabilities of these tools of Microsoft Teams so that they can really experience the benefits in their day-to-day work, their day-to-day work life, and staying connected, being able to collaborate from anywhere on any device, no matter what time zone they're in, and really keeping business results, at the forefront. So that's a really great news, and really a feat to celebrate with having such a great launch. And I love that your CIO, she rebadged her title to include digital. I think that's just such a great way of really meeting the evolution of the workforce and the workforce trends that we're seeing. And we're going to continue to evolve because technology is continuing to evolve, and we have to make sure with adoption change management to keep up with that people side and really help our people have the skills and the ability to take advantage of such wonderful, great capabilities. And you mentioned before, we've only just scratched the surface. So I think we have a lot more to do when it comes to really taking the workplace to that next level. So thank you, Jay, so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and expertise in providing some insights so that other organizations can understand how to really effectively make that smooth transition from Skype to Teams.
You're quite welcome, Jesse, and thank you for being a great partner to BAT and the US region of BAT, and helped us have a successful Teams migration to our entire organization. So thanks to you and your whole team.
Thank you so much, Jay. We were absolutely happy to step in and help when it comes to solving any business challenge out there, whether it's really focusing on adoption of Microsoft 365 or building an intranet or providing some hypercare. Absolutely, WM Reply, we're here to help not only with British American Tobacco, but other organizations. So we've now, Justin and I are going to field any questions in our audience. So feel free to post your questions into the Q&A chat box, and Justin and I will just start working our way through the questions. We're delighted to have questions, so feel free to post. We do have questions already popping up. The first one is there a good practice or rule of thumb to share around managing the number of chats in team spaces? What are your thoughts on that, Justin?
Thanks for the question. It's a bit of a challenge, I will admit, with respect to managing chats and channels. I think there's a couple different strategies that you can take. The first is having some rules of the road in terms of where you land different content. So for example, for my team, if we're doing something that's primarily work related or related to the function of the team overall, we try to land those conversations in Teams channels. For any sort of out of band conversations, we will have those available in chats. That being said, there's also some work that you can do with respect to managing your notifications, making sure you're not getting overloaded or bombarded with all of the updates that you get from Teams. This is an exercise I actually went through about 4 or 5 months ago, and it really helped in terms of sort of tuning down some of the noise that you can get in an application like Teams. The final thing I'd say there is I did a talk a couple years ago with one of our PMs from the Teams group, and he gave a really good explanation for why you should think about Teams a little bit differently than, say, thinking about email or some of the other communication tools. And the analogy he used is that you think of Teams as this river of information that's constantly flowing. And really what you want is you want the pieces that are actionable for you or that really are relevant for you. And so leveraging things like @mentions, notification settings, etc., can help you kind of tune that flow and get you only the content that's really important that you take action on or that you see. You shouldn't worry so much about seeing everything that's in Teams. It's not really built for that type of work style. There will be conversations that happen that you're not a part of, but if you need to be a part of them or you need to be notified of them or aware of them, the folks who are generating them should definitely leverage @mentions.
Those are some really great tips, Justin. Our next question is, what do you mean by a sponsor? For me, a sponsor is generally someone who can be an advocate for your project. Generally, a sponsor is someone in the executive leadership, C-suite, that can really leverage their influence in order to help make the project a success. What about you, Justin?
I'd agree with all of those. The only thing I'd add there is you need somebody who's managing kind of the overall vision of the project, right? So who's that person who's pushing it forward in the organization and who can help you to remove blockers? So if you run into issues that are policy-based, i.e., we need to do some work around getting our users enabled in Azure Active Directory, for example, or you run into things that are more business-based, right, in terms of how the organization functions. It's really key to be able to have these sponsors. We always, of course, look for sponsorship inside of IT as well, because there will be technical blockers, that we'll need to address. But it's really having somebody who can manage the project from a vision perspective and then help to remove blockers, whether those are technical or organizational.
Absolutely. And we did get a few different questions on whether or not we'll be sharing a recording of the webinar. Yes, we will absolutely get a recording of the webinar out there to all of you. So stay tuned for that after the webinar. But next up is how can you ensure everyone in your workforce in segments is using Teams? From the analytics, it was hard to see this. So I think there's a couple of different ways when you're looking at the analytics of being able to look at the different segments of your workforce. But Justin, I think you had mentioned that maybe even at the team owner level, there's going to be some new ways to visualize that data as well.
Yeah, today for team owners, there are some analytics that we include around things like channel messages, who's posting, etc. For a particular team. And then we have some top level metrics that are also available from the admin context. And then finally, we're also working on some work around what we call the productivity score for individual users. This will include Teams information and around specific interactions. But to address the question more specifically around how do you know or how do you ensure that everybody in your organization is using Teams? It really comes down to what type of content or communications you're landing in that platform. So any tool that we deploy inside of an enterprise or organization is only as valuable as the content or the information that users can extract out of it. So by starting to land either business processes or land affirmative communications in Teams, that will naturally draw folks to the application that may not otherwise have an affirmative use case, right? So they're not in sales or marketing or product development or something of that nature. Maybe they're more of a frontline worker, but you want to be able to disseminate information out to them more broadly and inculcate them into the conversation.
Yes, and we're also getting some questions about the coming soon or end of the life cycle for Skype for Business. Mm-hmm. We have a specific date on that. It's in 2021, so coming soon.
Yeah, it's July 31st, 2021. And so that is end of service for Skype for Business, right? As opposed to end of support, which we've had at many different times throughout the history of Microsoft. We'll still support Skype for Business on-prem, but for our customers who are in Skype for Business online, that will be a solution that will be going away in favor of Microsoft Teams. So you have a little bit over a year now in order to start preparing and moving, into Teams.
Yeah, so any organizations out there that are still on Skype, now is a good time to start and give yourself enough time so that it doesn't feel rushed. You can actually put together the people side of the plan and make sure that you've got a good user journey in place to make that transition as smooth as possible. And even if you're not on Skype, you're on something like Zoom or Blue Jeans or something else, and your organization really feels strongly that you want to make the switch so that you can capture that great ROI of being integrated with other Microsoft 365 projects, it's still a good idea to go ahead and ramp up, that switch now, because Teams does have new features coming out all of the time that are very, very exciting. So another question is there a way to subtitle on live events?
There is.
For people. Sorry, go ahead.
The great thing about live events is that effectively it's a video production platform. So typically, depending on how you run the event, you have two different options. So if you're running the event vis-a-vis Teams itself, right? And now we'll talk about how we're running this event today. But if you're producing everything just in Teams, then absolutely in Teams you can enable captioning. If you're doing something that's a little bit more on the video production side, then typically what you'll do is you will take the content and maybe generate subtitle files that you make available after the fact. Live events leverages the stream platform on the back end, which captures all of that information and makes it available for you. So we do things like generating transcripts that are searchable, indexing the meeting by faces, etc. And in some cases, generating those subtitle files. So all of those are available to you. But if you want to have a highly sort of produced meeting, which we do quite often at Microsoft, then generally that's going to be the purview of your video production team. And they'll take the feed off of Teams or a live event, and then they can run it through their own systems to add chyrons or any other information from a video production perspective. So we have quite a few customers that do that, using TriCasters or even something like an ATEM Mini, which is a small hardware device that allows you to have different effects or toggle between different cameras and then run that as one feed for your live event.
Wow, I'm learning more every day about Teams live events. So our next question is someone writing in to say they love Teams, and also to ask, do we know if there will be an update that allows different capabilities such as linking different groups that they're a part of, because some of the projects and teams overlap, but currently they have to bounce between groups and it kind of becomes cumbersome when managing multiple projects.
That's good feedback. So we're going to take it back to the team. I don't know that we have anything on the roadmap specifically around linking, but I think it relates back to the previous question of wanting to avoid being overloaded with all the information that happens in Teams. One thing I'd also note is that you can leave Teams, meaning that if you can join a team for the duration of a particular project or you're interested in it, you can also leave that team. Right, affirmatively as an end user. So if you're getting too many notifications or you find that the content just isn't relevant to you, you can certainly tune down the information that you get from there. But I think from a Teams perspective all up, there's different ways that the application can be organized, right? Teams can be functionally organized. They can be organized based on the structure of the organization, based on initiatives, etc. And as such, there will be some overlap between initiatives or projects, etc., or membership in those teams.
That's great information. Another audience member has asked, what are the extra benefits of Teams versus Skype for Business when selling the change to stakeholders? Absolutely.
So I think when you talk about Skype, right, the way we position Skype is really a pure communication solution. So when we were marketing that, we were selling it more actively to customers, it was all around unified communications and unifying those different silos of conferencing and calling and chat and collaboration into one application. Teams builds on that foundation to also add a whole additional set of capabilities around being able to integrate existing applications and services. It also allows you to rethink and start to reimagine business processes and build different components of those processes inside of teams. And what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, today you have a process in place for facilities requests. I need somebody to come turn down the AC. I need somebody to come pick up extra garbage that we have at our facility, etc. We can very easily take those kinds of processes and much more complex ones and land them in Teams as the user interface. So that person who needs to file that request would go into Teams. They would have an app that's embedded there. They submit the request, and then the person who receives the request would actually receive that as a Teams-based message. So it really starts to open up the world in terms of thinking about how you're running your business today and how you can start to reimagine some of those processes going forward.
Yeah, that's great information to have out there. So this question is kind of comparing Zoom to Teams, but the question is that Zoom has some live interactive webinar features like hands up and pressing buttons to say you agree, which is useful in training. Will Teams have some features like this in the future, or do they have similar features in place now?
The answer to that is yes and yes. So we have similar features that are in the pipeline that should be dropping soon. I think more interestingly, what we're seeing based on the current situation with COVID-19 and the big switch to a lot of folks working remotely is we're needing to take in that information and prioritize features that we've had in the pipeline for quite a bit of time. So you will start to see those capabilities drop fairly quickly. And some of the ones that you've called out there are definitely on that roadmap.
So this is a question around legal departments and retention periods. So what are the consequences of kind of keeping the chat history for too long, and what would you recommend as the ideal retention period for channels?
Great question. Well, traditionally, I would say from a legal perspective, the implications of keeping chats around too long is that they're another set of discoverable information. Typically, in the Skype for Business world, we would see customers either disable archiving completely because they didn't want to have that as a point of contention, or limit it to a very short window. In Teams today, you can actually turn your retention down to 1 day, which is the lowest that you can have for any set of messages. And it really comes down to how that organization leverages that type of historical information. I was working with another customer yesterday who's using a different system and is looking to migrate into Teams. And one of the questions they had was, how much of the information we have in the previous system should we bring over into Teams? And we got into this really interesting conversation around the half-life of information, which is so much shorter today than it has been in the past. So really thinking about how much of that information do we need to leverage in Teams, and how do we set the structure appropriately going forward in order to make folks successful.
Yeah, that's great information. Good tips to have for legal and compliance departments where that's a particular concern. Our next question is around a financial organization, and they're concerned that regulators won't allow the use of all functionality because messages can't be archived as many people discuss client financial information. So definitely a subject I'm sure a lot of financial services organizations out there are interested in.
Yeah, I mean, so archiving is interesting. We do have archiving from a team perspective, and from a chat retention perspective, you can configure Teams in such a way that we persist those messages in perpetuity. We will always capture them from an e-discovery perspective. So all messages that you write in Teams actually get committed in Exchange from an e-discovery perspective. So that's how we can search across them. And then we will commit other components of Teams. Artifacts, for example, sit in SharePoint. So when we run an e-discovery search, we're actually running that search across Exchange and across SharePoint, and we're including Teams content I would say for those financial services customers, we'd love to work with you to determine what's the appropriate set of policies that you need to have in place to meet those requirements. But certainly there's mechanism inside of the application to not only determine how long you retain content for, but more interestingly, set up things like ethical walls, inside of the team's application, so such that if there's certain projects that I should be working on, that I'm working on, and that then preclude me from being aware of or working on other projects, I can set that structure up inside of the Teams app.
Yeah, that's great. And so just to wrap things up for the last question of the day, and I think this one is meant for you, Justin, because of your fancy background, but it's a nice office, but where are you actually?
Just like everybody else, I'm sheltering in place and working from home. This is actually one of the capabilities we prioritized and released, which is the ability to have custom backgrounds in Teams, very similar to some of our competitors. This is one of the standard backgrounds that you're seeing here, but of course you can upload any content that you want and have that shown. That could be both custom content from a user perspective, or more interestingly from an organizational perspective, branded content. So if I wanted to say, I'm actually at Microsoft or I'm working for Microsoft, it'd be very easy for an organization to put that out as sort of a standard, and then all of those communications would be branded as such.
Yeah, so those fancy backgrounds do really come in handy in this moment in history when majority of us are working from home and we may need to disguise the goings on in our homes.
Exactly.
So Justin, I just want to say thank you so much. We're absolutely delighted to have you, and really all of the insights you have been providing to us and the organizations in the audience are just very, very helpful, and absolutely appreciate you being here. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So we have this webinar episode is one in our larger series, which is Fall in Love with the Teams webinar series. We have delivered a quick introduction to Team, but we've also partnered with some really great organizations, Swoop, to talk about how how's your team collaboration within your organization. We've partnered with Live Tiles around the topic of Teams being your intranet, and then also a great partner, Sideways 6, and how to really use ideation or employee IDs to enable business results. So if any of you out there are interested in viewing these webinars, give us a shout and we'll send you the recordings to them. So thank you to everyone for joining this webinar. We really hope that it was helpful. And of course, thanks again to Justin and Jay for being our fantastic speakers. Stay well, everyone.